Eisenberg's conviction in manipulating Solana DeFi platform Mango markets and stealing 110 million in cryptocurrency has sparked discussion on the legal implications of DeFi exploits. Sandy, what's your thoughts here?
This is an interesting one. I'll try not to get too technical about it, but I'll start off by saying, so what happens in a case like this? This happened with a lot of platforms back in DeFi summer, which is maybe more than 2 years ago now, 3 years ago. I'm losing track. With the rise of these decentralized exchanges, decentralized lending platforms, especially, came a lot of exploits which work on, I guess, the manipulation of the price of a token, because the whole concept of how these things work is based on the price of a particular token. You can deposit into a platform and then you can borrow out money against it, usually at max of 80% of the value, sometimes maybe 50% of the value. But you can borrow like stable coins against this more volatile asset. And then, in that way, you can then take the stable coins, invest in other things if you want, and you're preserving the value that you hope to gain from the more volatile assets. But the problem is, because it's all decentralized, everything's put into the pool, people then try to exploit these contracts. What this guy did is the platform allowed a pretty small volume volatile asset as a collateral. So what they've done is gone ahead and, using smart contracts, try to manipulate the price of that token so that suddenly the price of the token is worth many times more than it should be. Then they borrow out a much larger sum of money than they should be able to against its collateral. And then when the transaction is finished, the price dumps back down, and then now the protocol's basically got a bad debt because maybe there's $10 million say in this contract. They've made the price so high, this token price so high, that they can borrow out $5 million of that when they should only be able to borrow out 100,000, for example. And now all of a sudden, the people who had put the stablecoins in to let people borrow can't get their money back because the platform never should allow this much token to be borrowed by this volatile asset. The stablecoin can't be paid back anymore, and now there's a deficit. So that's how the basics of how this works. This developer tried to say it as well. There's a video out there saying that, well, look, I haven't done anything that the smart contract didn't allow me to do. Right? This is all within the rules of what the smart contract allowed. I think this guy actually tweeted after it happened that he said that, me and my team were involved in a very profitable trading strategy over the weekend.
That's the one. That's what I love. Highly profitable trading strategy.
Yeah, exactly. So they made this gain, and they're such a good white hat hacker. They're saying, well, we hacked like $100 million. We're offering to return you $60 million. We just want to keep 40 million, as a white hat bounty. So that's basically what they've done. And look, there are cases of white hat hacking, people that find exploits, they go ahead and hack the funds, and then they'll return it. So they might have hacked 100 million, 10 million, whatever it is, and they'll return it. And in return, often these protocols might give them like a white hat of 1%. So if the hack was $10 million, the guy still gets 100,000. That's a pretty good deal. And the people on the platform, if they had to make up for that hole, they're only making up with 1% of the asset. I think that's fair, right? Or the protocol maybe cover it themselves because they should have made things more secure. That's fair. But this guy has basically hacked $100 million and wanted to keep 40 million as a bounty. That's just. But on the legal side, the arguments I think are interesting. In this case, this guy has been found guilty of fraud. Not surprisingly, I think. The thing is, he's sort of opened multiple accounts under his own name and try to manipulate the perpetuals market to manipulate the prices of tokens so he can carry out this attack. There's a point at which it crosses into, for example, anybody that's hacking a bank system, for example, right? There are security measures in place, but then they find a way around it. And you can potentially argue, well, look, I found my way around it, but this is through code, right? This code had this flaw, I exploited it. You could try to argue, say, well, look, I technically didn't do anything that the code didn't allow me to do because I just found a workaround. But there's a point at which you go into fraud territory because the code is obviously not being used how it was supposed to be used. And you're kind of going around that intention, and you had this dishonest intention going into finding this workaround. So that's the point at which you cross into fraud. I think that here, with all this manipulation of the price through perpetual contracts, which all under his own name, that's what would have pushed into definite fraud territory. There are other attacks that's being done on platforms where they've used flash loans, for example, which again, I'll try not to get too technical, but flash loan is basically a way to borrow a large sum of money and return that money in one transaction, right? And that's allowed by lending platforms because within the same transaction, you borrow it, you use that money, could be $10 million, $100 million. You use that money to conduct an arbitrage trade, which is quite legitimate, right? Like you try to arbitrage, and with $100 million, if you earn 0.01%, it's still a lot of money. That's how these loans are supposed to be used. Now, if a hacker goes and uses a flash loan, which is, again, supposed to be allowed, then they buy up this token, which makes the price higher, which again is supposed to be how it's supposed to happen. And then they borrow out money because the platform allows it, because the token is now a much higher price. Again, that's supposed to happen. So if you take through all those steps using tools that are actually supposed to be used in that way, I think you have a problem with, like, legally speaking, has that been fraud? I'm not saying that it's not fraud, but I think in that case, things might be a bit more arguable. It might get a bit interesting. But look, at the end of the day, even if that's not fraud, it's just, even if it's legally not fraud, it's obviously dishonest, right? And it's obviously unethical. Like, if you ever did anything like that and try to keep most of the money as some sort of bounty, it's just like, I don't know what you're trying to like achieve there, or what you're trying to argue. At the end of the day, that's whatever legal arguments there are, you're going to be seen as a fraud.
I think you raised something really interesting, Sandy, about like what was the intention of the code. And obviously it wasn't to let this dude run off with $100 million. But the whole perspective that people have is that, law sucks and, code should be law. Like that's what sort of, hardcore coders think. But then when the code doesn't go right, you've got to either live with the consequences, or you've got to actually do that analysis and go, well, what do we really want to do? What was this intended to do? And it failed, should be fixed. And that's kind of like how legal interpretation works. For interpreting statutes, it's like, well, yeah, sure, here's what it says, but it might actually have a different meaning because of the context around it. And, courts can fix that. But when it's code, you can't. So whether it's fraud because of the specific actions on the smart contract is one thing, but if the overall outcome is fraud, then I think they get to the right decision. Like, but if you get too granular, I think you get a bit lost in those details. It's very hard to go, well, it wasn't meant for that to happen. It's like, well, it allowed for it. It did. Yeah,
I think the problem with this is, like, at this point, look, at this point, this sort of thing is pretty well known now. Like, if you use a low volume volatile token as a collateral, this can happen. You don't need to hack or manipulate the price using like perpetual contracts or whatever, or even a flash loan. Like, literally somebody who has $100 million capital can come in and do this with that money, because that's how these DeFi platforms work. If you dump $100 million into buying this token, the price is going to go up like 10,000 times. That's just how it works. If the price goes up 10,000 times, you can borrow a lot more money from it. Again, that's how these things work. So I think at this point, it's like really almost criminal for a lending platform to allow this to happen. But at the same time, you can't just say, well, so I had no security on my house and I left my door open. That doesn't mean it's now legal to steal from my house, right? There's still those kind of arguments as well. So you gotta find a balance. But like, I think at this point though, crypto being what it is, and the scene, like you say, a lot of these crypto natives will say that they like the fact that code is law. Well, in that case, you better make sure your code is up to scratch, because if you still allow this to happen in this day and age, after like dozens of exploits on similar platforms, you're really just being very negligent about this. Like, it really shouldn't happen anymore.
I think to change gears there, I think the real takeaway is, if you're going to do a highly profitable trading strategy that may be criminal, don't tweet about it on the internet.
That too, yes.
Like, this guy could have been a ghost, and they would have had to get chain analysis and law enforcement involved to find him. But within an hour, he was posting about how he did it on Twitter. That was probably the dumbest bit of the whole thing. Was, if you're going to commit crimes, don't put them on social media. A very good friend of mine always told me that. So, or just don't commit crimes is the alternative. Only suits some people, that one.
Just to add to that as well, Harry and Sandy, it almost brings in philosophical questions about how you want to be regulated for consumer protection purposes. So on the one hand, if you have the mentality that code should be law, if there's any deficiencies in the code that allows for exploitation of the platform, then tough luck, suck it up mentality. There are some people in the space that are quite happy to have that as an actual way of governing themselves. But for the layperson who's wanting to enter the cryptocurrency space, they need sufficient protections in place. And so, this goes back to conversations I remember hearing back in 2017 about the philosophical arguments of regulating cryptocurrencies. It's almost worth considering, at least, if you are going to create a decentralized platform that allows, it's not intended to allow for, but where there's a vulnerability of code being exploited, having some sort of disclaimer, I don't know whether you could have that even in the protocol itself, that effectively warns anyone that wants to participate in that platform that, look, there are risks here. you can be exploited for this amount of money. Now, this can all exist in a decentralized way of doing things. And then conversely, you can have centralized, or not centralized, but cryptocurrencies that are regulated centrally, so where code isn't law. And then those actors or those participants or those developers are now accountable legally for any exploitation of the code. So there's no question around whether, okay, the code allowed us to do this. It allowed me to exploit this. And you don't have to go into the splitting of hairs around legal arguments as to whether this was in fact allowed to occur. So it's interesting. I just found it, and this is what I love about cryptocurrencies, is that it brings in so many philosophical discussions about how you want things to be governed from the ground up.